spellbound. It's Alfred Hitchcock.
In February 1927, London audiences got their first real taste of an Alfred Hitchcock film. The Lodger is now recognized as the first Hitchcock masterpiece. But as the director himself liked to recall, the film, and with it his career, was very nearly stillborn.
Unfortunately, when the film was finished, the distributors sent down two representatives to view the film, and they came out and said it was awful, and it was a dreadful picture. Well, you know, this is a pretty low ebb to get. And it was on the shelf for about 2 months, and then they decided to show it after all. They felt they had an investment. And it was shown, and was acclaimed as the greatest British picture ever made to that date. So there you see is that thin red line between failure and success. How do you do? I am Alfred Hitchcock, and I would like to tell you about my latest motion picture, Marnie, which will be coming to this theater soon.
In a 60-year career that began with hand-crank cameras and silent movie stars, and ended with widescreen Technicolor and method actors, Hitchcock would taste both success and failure in pursuit of his simple goals.
He wanted fame, he wanted fortune, he wanted the right to make his own art in his own way, and he got all those things.
Along the way, he would create a world as strange as his own personality.
Don't be afraid.
A Hitchcockian world where glamour and thrills are stalked by fear and guilt.
How do you do? My name is Alfred Hitchcock, and I would like to tell you about my forthcoming lecture. It is about the birds and their age-long relationship with man.
Oh, there were a lot of Hitchcocks involved with Mr. Hitchcock. He used to think of himself as being a very simple man. He was extremely complicated. Extremely complicated.
That's the great question. Is this man a technician, or is he a genius with soul and spirit, and is he maybe the greatest filmmaker of all time?
This is Alfred Hitchcock speaking. In the past, I have introduced you to many kinds of people. Murderers, thieves, swindlers, many of them geniuses at the business of crime.
Cruelty, fear, loneliness, paranoia, dark feelings.
Big stars, outstanding supporting cast, brilliant color, imaginative settings, great locations.
Murder, mayhem, violence, sex, beautifully pictorially expressed, lovely costumes, perfect cutting, and a joke or two.
Hitchcock's 1936 thriller Sabotage is set in a world of street markets, shopkeepers, and bobbies on the beat.
Don't you know that's very dangerous?
What?
Leaving stuff like that lying about. Supposing you or me was to break our leg on that. You'd be very pleased with yourself, I suppose?
That would depend whether it was your leg or mine. Can't tempt you, I suppose. Oranges. Very nice today. Good for the feet.
It was a world that Hitchcock knew well. It was the world in which he had grown up.
Hitchcock is often described as having working-class Cockney origins. He wasn't really working class. I mean, his father was a greengrocer, wholesale and retail, and there was a very important distinction between being lower middle class, having your own business, being a shopkeeper and something, and being actually working class. And Hitchcock was definitely on the middle class side of this divide. And I think they were always conscious of it.
Born in August 1899 above the family's High Street shop in the London suburb of Leytonstone, Alfred Joseph Hitchcock was the youngest of the three children of Emma and William Hitchcock.
The father seems to have been, in certain respects, a fairly strict disciplinarian, but his mother seems to have been the tougher of the two parents, and he remained in awe of her throughout her life.
My grandmother, my father's mother, Emma, was a wonderful character. I mean, absolutely. She was very forceful. You can imagine a young person would be scared of her, you know, his son, because she, you know, she made them toe the line.
Once I said to him, in your films, mothers have a very bad time, or mother figures have, haven't they? Does this tie up with anything in your own childhood? And you know, the old man's eyes, he was then in his 60s, began almost to water. Whether with malevolence or with grief or sadness, I don't know, but he didn't welcome the question.
He talked to me about his bringing up, which was not easy. It was a rather narrow, prejudiced, lower middle class life.
The Hitchcocks were devout Catholics, a fact that film critics of the future would make much of.
Est-ce que vous acceptez d'être considéré comme un artiste catholique?
Do you accept to be regarded as a Catholic artist?
It does come in, it's true. It may be that one's upbringing is so
l'éducation est tellement
inculquée, oui.
With the early aspects of religion, that
avec les aspects initiaux de la religion,
drives one's instincts.
Que
you know.
ça mène
For example,
au monastère.
in many films.
But perhaps the biggest influence on the future filmmaker was an incident that became an essential part of the Hitchcock legend.
At a very tender age, I was frightened by a policeman. I don't remember now what it was I'd done, but my father sent me along to the police station with a note. He locked me in a cell for 5 minutes and finally says, that's what we do to naughty boys.
I do believe that story. Hitchcock frequently told it until we were sick of hearing it. But I do think that it is exactly the explanation of many of the fears in his films. The fear not necessarily of being physically locked up, but the fear suddenly of finding yourself in a situation you can't control.
What are you afraid of, Mr. Hitchcock?
Oh, I'm afraid of policemen, the wrong side of the law, trouble, authority descending upon me, putting its heavy hand on my shoulder and making my stomach turn over with fear.
Hitchcock's education in the ways of the world continued at the age of 11 when he was sent to St. Ignatius College, a fee-paying school run by Jesuits. The Jesuits were notorious for their approach to discipline.
Going to the Jesuit school, you know, you're taught that you have to live life in fear and guilt. You're told that, you know, you have to be very cautious in life. You have to be very cautious because you have evil within you, other people do. You know, good and evil are not separate, but they are inextricably bound in one and the same person.
In 1914, when Hitchcock was just 15, his father died. Forced to leave St. Ignatius, he found work in an engineering company. But Hitchcock was never the average 9-to-5 office worker.
When he was a teenager, I think he was working in the city, he didn't, at lunchtime, he didn't go to a pub and stand around with a glass of beer in his hand and a sandwich. He went to a proper restaurant, dressed properly, went to a proper restaurant, ordered a proper lunch, had a cigar afterwards. In other words, he knew the kind of human being and the kind of character he was going to be, even then.
In 1920, Hitchcock's hobby took him to a former power station in Islington, North London. Alfred Hitchcock was about to enter the movies.
I heard that an American company were coming to London to open a studio. So I applied for the job of designing their titles because those were the silent days. And titles were an important part of the picture.
It was at the Islington studios that Hitchcock would meet the most important person in his life. Alma Reville, a talented film editor in her own right, and the future Mrs. Hitchcock.
She was really smart and extremely knowledgeable about film. And they were so close. They were a pair for all those years. And, you know, they read each other's minds.
She actually was born in Nottingham, and then I think the family moved to Twickenham. When she was in school, I know she was afflicted with a disease called St. Vitus's dance, and had to miss 2 years of school. And, you know, she was so bright, too, that it was such a shame. And that's why I think she went straight into the picture business.
She was already in the quite important position of film editor, whereas he was just a general dog's body. And he was immediately attracted to her, but he said he didn't dare ask her to come out with him until he was of a commensurate position himself. So as soon as he had become actually an assistant director, he dared to ask her out.
If she didn't like somebody, you knew it, and he knew it. And if she didn't like something he did, she said it. She was never shrewish. She was simply a woman with opinions that she voiced. I liked her for that.
Though he liked to say that he had no particular ambition, Hitchcock rose rapidly at the Islington studios. With the film industry still in its infancy, his innate self-confidence made him an unstoppable force.
I was very content when I was going to get the job in as assistant director. And then they said, well, do you know of a good writer we can get? I said, I'll write it. And then my friend, who was going to be the art director on the picture, he said he couldn't come. He had another job. Said, what are we going to do for an art director? I said, I'll do the art direction.
But Hitchcock was still serving his apprenticeship. In 1925, he received the education of a lifetime when he was sent to work on an Anglo-German co-production at the UFA studios in Berlin. UFA, the world's largest studio, was the home of German expressionist cinema. Watching the likes of Murnau and Lang at work, Hitchcock learned much about the power of the director. And there were other lessons too.
He learned so much about the use of shadow, the use of camera angles that were unconventional, off-center framing, shots from above, shots from below. Those kind of things were part and parcel of the style of German Expressionism, and I think Hitchcock adapted those very neatly into his cinematic grammar.
German Expressionism may have exerted a stylistic influence on Hitchcock, but the lessons of Soviet cinema went deeper. Soviet filmmakers showed Hitchcock that meaning in a film could be conveyed by the dynamic juxtaposition of images, a technique known as montage. In a montage sequence, acting becomes a matter of stylized gestures and expressions, which become significant only when placed alongside other images. It was a principle that Hitchcock would apply throughout his career, to the dismay of many of his actors.
The medium of pure cinema is what I believe in. The assembly of pieces of film to create fright is the essential part of my job.
The Russians felt that, cinema to them was propaganda, was education. They felt that they could make the audience think and feel in a certain way. They could manipulate the audience. And Hitchcock wanted this. He loved playing God. He loved this mass emotion that could be created in terms of the juxtaposition of images. How you can bring them to a high, bring them to a low, how you can make them scream, how you can make them laugh. He loved this. He loved that.
Kill Cock Robin.
He took me to dinner one night and he said, Ernie, what we're doing is we're sitting at an organ and we're pressing this chord, which makes an audience go, ooh. And then we press this chord, which makes them laugh. And we're just playing on them. And he said, someday we won't need the movie.
Hitchcock created his first effects early in 1927 with the release of his debut films, The Pleasure Garden, The Mountain Eagle, and The Lodger. The Pleasure Garden performed respectably, The Mountain Eagle less well, but The Lodger was a sensation. For once, British critics had a homegrown product to rave about. And for the public, there was a sensational storyline coupled with the charms of matinee idol Ivor Novello. But for Hitchcock, it had been a tough initiation. All three films had been shelved for months, condemned by the distributor as unshowable. The Lodger, in particular, was suspected of being arty, a kiss of death in the British film industry at that time.
He used to tell me that when he first started in the industry, you actually had distributors on the doorsteps in Wardour Street shouting, "Have I got a film for you? Have I got a film for you?" And I think he realized early on, even if he wanted to be artistic himself, that you couldn't let this be seen too much, that it would be a great mistake because people wouldn't take you seriously if you did.
Throughout his career, Hitchcock would grouse about the crassness of distributors and the stupidity of studio executives, but rarely would he rebel against them. He never felt comfortable asserting the claims of the artist over the responsibilities of the businessman.
You can't indulge yourself for $5.9 million. A lot of people's jobs attached to this figure. I used to look at the men lining up at Warner Brothers carrying their dinner pails, clocking on in a long line. I said to myself, is this an art form? And that is, therein lies the whole problem between the artistic and the commercial, is the cost of expression.
What Hitchcock looked for from a studio was a simple understanding. He would turn out popular films on time and on budget. In return, he expected to be left alone to make his own films in his own way. This was the deal on which his life as a filmmaker would be based. But Hitchcock had more to offer studios than just his talent. In the opening scenes of The Lodger, sharp-eyed critics spotted an extra who looked strangely familiar. It was the first of the celebrated Hitchcock cameos.
My mother wasn't born a Catholic, but she became a Catholic when she married my father, and they were married at Brompton Oratory in London. We lived in London, we lived on Cromwell Road, number 153, and then on weekends we would go down to Surrey, near Guildford, a place called Shamley Green, and we had a place called Shamley Cottage, and I had horses down there, and I loved it. He loved making the home movies and, you know, hammed it up all the time and had a wonderful time. But that was his great sense of humor, and that's what he had in everything. And the sort of staid person that everybody thought he was purely an act.
Hitchcock's career, meanwhile, continued to blossom. Wooed away from Islington by British International Pictures at Elstree, Britain's hottest young director was the natural choice to direct the first British talkie, Blackmail.
Every conceivable kind of problem happened, all of which Hitchy took in his stride. But he had one big problem, and that was Annie Andra, who was the little star of the picture. Annie Andra was supposed to be a little English girl, a little London girl, the daughter of a tobacconist. And Annie Andra was Czech, Czechoslovakian, and Annie Andra had a very, very strong accent.
Well, Annie Andra, naturally, with a Czech accent, she couldn't possibly continue, but too much had been photographed. So I got another young actress, whose name was Joan Barry, to sit on the side with her own mic. And Annie Andra, the Czech girl, just mouthed her words so that they both synchronized.
Frank, I've changed my mind again.
What about?
About going to the pictures.
You mean you don't want to go again?
No, not particularly.
Why not?
Blackmail was hailed as another Hitchcock triumph. But after this, the director lost his way. Leaving BIP at the height of the Depression, he ended up directing a musical, his first and only venture into the genre. He was rescued by Michael Balkan, the producer who had given him his first break as a director at Islington. The Man Who Knew Too Much was the first of the so-called thriller cycle. 6 films in 4 years, which Hitchcock made for Balkan's Gaumont British studio, and which would earn him the title, the Master of Suspense. With 20 films to his credit, the Master of Suspense was by now master of the studio floor.
He sat on this chair. I thought he reminded me of Buddha. And he wasn't the sort of person that everybody could go up and chat to all the time. I mean, he was quite sort of remote and self-contained.
Hitch was very much a showman. And so he created that sort of atmosphere around him. And of course, one of total authority. There was no other authority on the set. There was nowhere else to look. He was it.
He knew exactly what he wanted. I remember one particular instant, that stayed with me the whole of my life. He walked on the set on the very first day, had a script in his hand, put it down on the sound recording desk and said, right, another one in the bag. He knew exactly what he was going to do, and in his mind the film was already shot.
Everything is decided on paper. I do not improvise while the picture is being made. A little bit is permissible, but if you don't make your picture on paper ahead of time with all the desired effects, if you cannot visualize or hear, then this would be like a musician composing with a full orchestra in front of him. So he's got his blank music and saying, flute, give me a note, will you please? And the flute gives him, thank you very much, and he writes it down. There's the comparison. I think the film should be made on paper ahead of time.
Suspense was the key to the Hitchcock thriller. Working with screenwriter Charles Bennett and with Alma contributing to script treatments and continuity, Hitchcock turned suspense into an exact science.
The element of suspense is giving an audience information. Now, you and I are sitting here. Suddenly a bomb goes off. Up we go, blown to smithereens. What have the audience had watching this scene? 5 or 10 seconds of shock. Now, we do the scene over again, but we tell the audience there's a bomb underneath this table and it's going to go off in 5 minutes. Now, this innocuous conversation about football becomes very potent. They say, don't talk about football, there's a bomb under there. That's what they want to tell us. Then their anxieties will be as long as that clock ticks away. But the bomb must never go off. I once committed a grave error in having a bomb from which I'd extracted a great deal of suspense. And I had the thing go off, which I should never have done, because they needed the relief from their suspense. Somebody should say, oh my goodness, look, there's a bomb. Pick it up, throw it out the window, bang. Yeah. I made the mistake. I let the bomb go off and kill someone. Bad technique.
In a Hitchcock thriller, The thing which seems to be of primary importance generally turns out to be what he called the MacGuffin, the least important thing of all.
It is only a matter of days, perhaps hours, before the secret is out of the country.
I don't care about content at all. The film can be about anything you like, so long as I'm making that audience react in a certain way to whatever I put on the screen. And if you begin to worry about the details of what are the papers about that the spies are trying to steal, well, that's a lot of I can't be bothered with what the papers are, what the spies are after. In Kipling's day, it was the plans of the fort. Well, how can you bring out the plans of the fort? Do you want the public to measure them or something?
Haven't you seen anyone with a twitch yet?
Too many people.
You must find him.
Well, I can't ask them all if they twitches come on. Now we've bitten off more than we can chew here, Ducky.
He must be here somewhere.
Hitchcock was indifferent to content because what really interested him was what he called pure cinema. An elaborate montage sequence or a complex camera move. For him, these were the essence of the filmmaker's art.
Tell you, sister, no one can like the drummer man. Every man who plays in the band is wonderful too. I've got to give credit where credit is due. But when it comes to make that music make you give it all it's got, I'm right here to tell you, mister, no one can like the drummer man.
The British thrillers gave Hitchcock an international reputation, and by the end of the 1930s, he was ready for the biggest move in his career. Hitchcock had been circling Hollywood for a number of years, tempted by the resources that only the big American studios could offer. He knew that a move to Hollywood meant giving up the autonomy he had won in England. In return, he was looking for money, security, and prestige projects. In 1938, he signed a 7-year contract with producer David O. Selznick, and the following fateful year, 1939, the Hitchcocks left England for America.
We always knew that it was a permanent move to coming our way, It's no gamble at all because he had a 7-year contract with David Selznick, so we knew, he was going to be at least 7 years. And pretty much after that, you would live there.
Hitchcock's first American film was to be Rebecca, based on the popular novel by Daphne du Maurier. It didn't take too long to discover what working for Selznick meant.
David O. Selznick was born in 1902 and he died in 1965 at the age of 63. No wonder, for he was an obsessive, pill-popping workaholic.
He is a very dogmatic and imperious sort of man. He controlled his films. No one else made them, no one else condemned them. He was always the principal person. And with Hitchcock, this didn't go over so well. The two of them would fight about script, mostly, because David Selznick had great respect for the original material that he used. He demanded that the dialogue be from the book, that the settings should match the descriptions in the book. David insisted on lifting the book right into the film, and Hitchcock wanted to make the film regardless of the book.
How could I ask you to love me when I knew you loved Rebecca still? Whenever you touched me, I knew you were comparing me with Rebecca.
What is the mystery of Rebecca? What dread secret is hidden within the silent walls of Manderley?
They rankled over the cost. Selznick said $750,000 top and a 30-day shoot. And Hitchcock said no. So he said, okay, $80,000, another memo, $80,000 top, 30-day shoot. Hitchcock said no. So finally, Hitchcock got him around to $947,000 budget and a 48-day shoot. What Hitchcock spent was, in reality, $1.28 million on Rebecca and shot it for 63 days.
Good evening, Mr. De Winter.
What the devil do you think you're doing?
But it's the picture, the one in the gallery. What is it? What have I done?
Go and take it off. Doesn't matter what you put on, anything will do. What are you standing there for? Didn't you hear what I said?
Sir George and Lady Moore, Dudley Tennant, Admiral and Lady Burbank.
Selznick gave Hitchcock opportunities. I mean, it was like, if you take the train set analogy that Orson Welles used, this is the best train set a boy ever had. Selznick gave Hitchcock an electric train set compared with a clockwork train set. It was more sophisticated, it worked better, it did more tricks. I think in hindsight, you'd have to say that the antagonism was very fruitful. I mean, it was a pretty good partnership.
Rebecca is one of Hitchcock's most popular pictures, but he felt it was always more Selznick's than his, a feeling confirmed when the film won the 1940 Oscar for Best Picture, an award that went to the producer, not the director. It was to be the first of several near misses for Hitchcock, and he would end his career without a single Oscar to his name. Of the 10 films Hitchcock made while under contract, only 3 were for Selznick. But the Lone Art films include some of his most powerful work, with memorable performances from the stars with whom he would be most closely associated. With his flair for self-publicity, Hitchcock was by now a familiar, if rather unconventional, part of the Hollywood landscape. On the home front, however, life at the Hitchcocks was, according to Alma, anything but unconventional.
Our house is in Beverly Hills, no swimming pool. He says that would be too obvious. We have a very average home life, I should say. Most days, even non-working days, we go to bed early, around 9:30, and we wake early. Hitch wakes about 6:30. His masseur arrives at 7, pummels him around. When he gets home at night, we have dinner. Sitting in our breakfast nook, then read for a while. Before you know it, it's 9:30 and time for bed again.
He was curiously a homebody who enjoyed his work. That was his life. And his wife, and he was mad about Pat.
My parents were not social. They'd rather stay at home, and they would entertain, at home. They would go to, a couple of parties, but only if they were very close friends.
Hitchcock's contract with Selznick was due to run out in 1946. Selznick urged him to renew it, but the director was already planning his bid for freedom. In 1946, the trade papers announced the setting up of Transatlantic Pictures, an independent production company headed by Hitchcock and producer Sidney Bernstein. Bolstered by Bernstein and a $5 million loan from an American bank, Hitchcock finally revealed the kind of filmmaker he was when left to his own devices. The master of suspense announced plans for Under Capricorn, a costume melodrama starring Ingrid Bergman, and a modern-day version of Hamlet with Cary Grant. But first came Rope.
Open it.
One of the reasons that Hitch was interested in Rope was that he's interested in anything kinky.
Don't.
We've got to see if there's
I
anything.
know. But not just yet. Let's stay this way for a minute.
He was fascinated with homosexuality because that was the subject. Though the word homosexual was never used, I thought it was quite obvious. He did like to know what he considered perverse things about anyone. He had no moral judgment about it. He just kind of enjoyed knowing. He was much more interested in people who were off-center, in every sense of the word.
Reveling in his newfound independence, Hitchcock also devised a radical shooting technique for Rope, the 10-minute take.
This was the first film he had done away from Selznick, who evidently he grew to loathe and despise. And so I think he wanted to do something, you know, quite different and interesting.
What about the concert?
These hands will bring you great fame.
Oh, yes. That size is very handy. Extremely. Well, I consider myself a very fortunate man today. I'm on hand.
Rope was the antithesis of Hitchcock's tried and trusted montage method.
Yes, of course.
Rather than being made from the assembly of small pieces of film, it was shot in continuous 10-minute takes, the length of a single reel of film. To achieve this, the massive Technicolor camera had to be able to roam at will through a specially designed set crowded with actors, technicians, props, and equipment. Undeterred by Rope's disappointing box office performance, Hitchcock pushed on with plans for Under Capricorn, to be shot at Elstree Studios in England.
Arrivals at Heathrow. Film star Ingrid Bergman and director Alfred Hitchcock come in from Hollywood.
There were many errors made. The first, as I say,
beaucoup d'erreurs de fait. La première a été
first was that I felt that arriving in London, at London Airport,
il me semblait l'arrivée à Londres, à l'aéroport de
with
Londres,
Bergman,
avec Bergman,
here am I, Hitchcock, the one-time English
voici moi,
director,
le
returning to London,
autrefois ancien
with
directeur
the
britannique,
biggest star
de
of the
retour
day.
à Londres, avec la plus grande vedette de l'époque.
This seemed at the time to
Ceci me
be
semblait au moment même
very important.
être très important.
And this is where I was juvenile
Et là, c'est là où j'ai été juvénile
and stupid.
et idiot.
Still wedded to the 10-minute take, Hitchcock struggled to adapt it to a sprawling costume drama.
I remember one day when we were working, Hitch threw down his pencil and stood up and said, "This film's going to be a flop." Oi. And he disappeared. Now, this wasn't like him, and that haunted me. This film is going to be a failure.
Yes.
Bring it up here, please, quickly. In there, on the end of my bed.
Where did you say it was?
There, on my bed. You can see it quite plainly. It won't move.
For all its technical virtuosity, the 10-minute take proved an expensive way to make films. One mistake, however trivial, meant reshooting an entire reel. On Under Capricorn, Hitchcock finally admitted defeat, reserving the technique for a few set pieces.
It won't worry you anymore.
Thank you. I'm so sorry to bother you. I'm very much obliged to you, Charlie. You've been most kind. Good night.
But by now the film was over budget. It died at the box office, and Transatlantic died with it, driven into bankruptcy.
You're bothered by rats, I see.
The failure of Transatlantic was a watershed in Hitchcock's career. Never again would he venture outside the studio system. The system would make him one of the richest and most successful directors in Hollywood. It would support the creation of his most popular and enduring work. It would turn him into an international star. And ultimately, it would frustrate his ambitions and make him a prisoner of his own success.
The foregoing has made it obvious to me that we've had quite enough for one evening. We shall save the rest until next week, when I shall reappear. Until then, good night.
Hollywood History rides into town to look at the Western at 7 tonight on UK TV History. Next, though, Hitchcock's work gets more intense in Alfred the Auteur. Don't go away.
T13, take one.
Your profile? Yeah. Talk to him, Marty, from here.
Listen, Teddy, we don't do us all a favor. You tell us.
Now, don't turn the body to him.
Excuse me.
That's it. Now, talk to him in profile.
Pardon me, Marty?
Yeah, would you explain the name Tippy? Where does it originate from?
It's a Swedish nickname.
For what?
For Tupsa.
For what?
Tupsa.
Would you say that again, please?
Tupsa.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That's an anatomical term. Meaning?
Tupsa.
Little girl.
Oh, really?
Yes. In Swedish.
November 1961. Alfred Hitchcock directs a screen test.
Look at those people there out there. Who the hell they think they are?
The woman is Tippi Hedren. A former model, she has never acted before. Hitchcock plans to make her the star of his next film, The Birds. For Hollywood's most successful director, fresh from the triumph of Psycho, nothing seems impossible.
So many people were saying, how can you do this, Hitch? Put somebody totally unknown, has never acted before. How can you put this woman into, this film that you're going to do? It's going to be a major motion picture. And Hitch gave me the assurance that I could do it.
He confided that he felt he was at the top of his form, that he was entering his golden age of filmmaking. Everything was still ahead of him. And he was brimming all the time with ideas. We ought to do a film about that, or this, or... And indeed, I felt he was at the top of his form.
But Hitchcock's golden age would be a bumpy ride for the director and those closest to him. The successes of the past would prove elusive, and the man who valued order above all else would court chaos in his emotional life.
T14, take one.
Marty, I'm sending over to you a high priestess. But of what, you'll have to decide for yourself.
Hitchcock liked to say his definition of happiness was a clear horizon. But even as he screen tested his new star, the storm clouds were gathering. In the early 1950s, Alfred Hitchcock was looking for a home. Brought to Hollywood in 1939 by David Selznick, he had endured 7 years of interference and financial exploitation before finally slipping the leash and forming his own company, Transatlantic Pictures. But Transatlantic collapsed, and with it the director's hard-won reputation for box office bankability. At Warner Brothers, he went some way to burying the memory of the failure of Rope and Under Capricorn, with hits like Strangers on a Train. What he needed now was a secure base from which to prove once and for all that he was a force to be reckoned with. Paramount Studios was to be that home.
The Paramount people felt that this was a logical home for Hitchcock. They gave him every single opportunity and every single convenience he needed. There was never an argument. Hitchcock would come in and say, I want to do this picture, and they would say, yes. When? They'd never say why, but when.
This is the apartment of a man named Jeffries, a news photographer whose beat used to be the world. Right now, his world has shrunk down to the size of this window.
Hitchcock's sense of security at Paramount is apparent in the choice of his first film, Rear Window. Told almost entirely from the point of view of a wheelchair-bound Jimmy Stewart, and shot on an elaborate set, Rear Window managed to be both experimental and crowd-pleasing.
This is the traveling salesman and his invalid wife. Out of their arguments and nagging comes a weird kind of love. Miss Torso, the body beautiful. That is, viewed from a safe distance.
It was a very quiet set, very well organized set, and I remember lots of people visiting the set. Sometimes Mr. Hitchcock would close it, but he was very proud of it. That imagine my little apartment had everything but running water and ice cubes. I had my bed, and I mean, I had food there, and it was complete. This whole little village, if you will. Sort of like Mr. Hitchcock's dollhouse, playing with his little dolls and placing them where he wanted them.
The most beautiful doll in the doll's house was Grace Kelly.
How's your leg?
Every man who ever was lucky enough to work with Grace Kelly fell in love with her, me included. I'm sure even Hitchcock, nobody could be in her presence and not fall in love with her. She's a lovely person.
Anything else bothering you?
Mm-hmm. Who are you?
Reading from top to bottom. Lisa. Carol. Fremont.
Rear Window, her second role for the director, confirmed Kelly as the ultimate Hitchcock blonde.
Have you any idea at all why you have this obsession with this kind of woman?
I'm only obsessed because I don't believe in stamping the woman with the word sex all over her. I think it should be discovered in the course of our getting acquainted with her. And it's more interesting for this thing to be not apparent. In other words, we don't have to have the sex hanging round her neck like baubles all over her.
I'll soon fix that. There, miss. Now you're a special constable.
What's the idea? What you doing?
As long as you stay, he stays.
Yes, and as long as I go, you go. Come on.
Stop them. They've got away.
The Hitchcock blonde has a long history, which goes as far back as Madeleine Carroll in the 39 Steps. Glamorous and glacial, Hitchcock's dream woman is usually brought down to earth with a bump.
He always used to take women who were very, very much in control of their lives and put them in a situation of just great upheaval and see how they come out. Do they survive? How do they survive? Interesting.
It's always been assumed that Hitch was some kind of misogynist, but I have the impression from a number of things that he told me later on that if you're thinking of his films, that he wasn't identifying so much with the glamour male figures, the Cary Grants, the James Stewarts, and so on, but if he was identifying with anybody, it was with the suffering heroine. In fact, he always, as far as I can make out, enjoyed the company of women, perhaps more than he enjoyed the company of men. He certainly always had female assistants, female secretaries. Alma, his wife, of course, was his most important assistant and collaborator throughout his career.
By now, the Hitchcocks were firmly established in their adopted home. In Hollywood, they lived in a modest bungalow in Bel Air, but their favorite place was San Francisco. The city and the surrounding area would provide an unforgettable setting for one of Hitchcock's most haunting films, Vertigo. Vertigo remains one of Hitchcock's most enigmatic and, according to some, revealing films. The story of a man who tries to make over a woman in the image of one who is dead is said to echo Hitchcock's own efforts to recreate his ideal actress. With Vertigo, Hitchcock had made a real attempt to move beyond the traditional suspense formula, but few critics appreciated the effort. One called the film far-fetched nonsense and claimed it made him feel carsick. Others were less kind.
I think they're very nice. I think they're very human. They're subject to all kinds of human foibles, is that the word? And I think they mean very well. I'm not going to stress the word mean. I said they mean very well. And they have their job to do, and I have my job to do.
Mr. Hitchcock, wenn Sie jetzt sofort einen Kriminalfilm in der Schweiz machen müssten.
When he was dealing with critics, he was dealing with the enemy, because they were analyzing what he was doing. They weren't surrendering to it. And consequently, in his interviews, he kept on giving you what you expected. He wasn't going to allow anyone to slip under his guard. His interviews, like the trailers that he made for the films, were there to conceal things rather than to expose things. An interview for Hitchcock was like a living autopsy. There he was spread out, still alive, and you were cutting him open.
But even as Vertigo received a mauling at the pens of the American and British critics, elsewhere a powerful counter-movement was underway. The master of suspense was about to become the master auteur.
La fine équipe des cahiers, entre François, Godard aussi, Romer en tout cas, et moi finalement, on s'est retrouvé beaucoup, cette espèce d'amitié qui est née beaucoup grâce à Hitchcock parce qu'on était 4 ou 5 comme ça à nous être aperçus qu'il y avait une espèce de profondeur presque vertigineuse dans les films d'Hitchcock.
The French relished the way in which you could take a Hitchcock scene apart in fine detail. You could dissect it, and every cut, every angle, every positioning was clearly chosen. It was pointed, and it did something. And in that way, Hitchcock demonstrated what directing was, that someone made the film, and it was the director. And the French loved that idea, partly because they wanted to be film directors. And I think the English attitude was, well, he's just a terrific professional. Bit of a tease, rather droll, but come on, let's keep our feet on the ground.
We are now on the air.
Nous sommes maintenant sur l'air.
The canonization of Hitchcock by the French New Wave culminated in one of the more extraordinary encounters in the history of the cinema, when critic and director François Truffaut embarked on an interview with his hero that lasted for over 50 hours. Part interrogation, part act of homage, Truffaut, with collaborator Helen Scott acting as interpreter, led Hitchcock step by step through his life and career. Disarmed by Truffaut's affectionate respect, the director put aside the Hitch persona and went further than he had ever done before in revealing the real Alfred Hitchcock.
Why is it that the love scenes
Pourquoi est-ce que les
les
scènes d'amour que je mets dans mes
usually so strong?
sont tellement fortes?
I don't get any particular kick out of doing that sort of scene
personnellement, ça
myself.
ne me donne aucune sensation particulière de faire une
As
scène.
we've discussed before, I'm a celibate, you know.
Parce que comme nous l'avons dit avant, je suis moi un célibat.
I mean, I'm not against it.
Je dis, je ne suis pas contre.
But I just don't
Ça nous amène à
think
une
about
question
it
que vous voulez
very
lui poser.
much, you know.
Mais je n'y pense pas beaucoup, dit-il.
Ah, vos films en sont pleins.
Yes, but your pictures are full of it.
Well, I would say then maybe that's the outlet, huh?
Alors je dis, c'est peut-être les coulées, c'est ça que je veux dire.
Peut-être, comme oui, comme les crimes d'ailleurs.
As the crimes, as a matter of fact.
Maybe.
The Truffaut interview confirmed Hitchcock as a leading auteur-director. But to his increasing annoyance, he would never escape his other reputation as master showman.
You really are, and I mean this as a compliment, you really are a sort of ace manipulator, it seems to me, because you know so much about the tricks of the trade.
Don't you think technique would be a nicer word? If I were a painter, would you call strokes of the brush tricks?
Ironically, the one thing that above all others stopped him from being taken seriously as an artist was the very thing that contributed most to his fame.
Oh, good evening. I was just about to send greetings to an old friend.
For 10 years, starting in 1955, Hitchcock's TV shows were among the most popular on American screens. Produced by his protege, Joan Harrison, they were relished for their clever twists and high production values, but most of all for Hitchcock's introductions, written for him by Jimmy Allardyce.
He would do anything that Jimmy asked him to do for the lead-ins. Thus, you had Hitch inside a bottle. Then you had Hitch in golfing knickers, playing golf in a most outlandish outfit. You had Hitch playing his own brother. You had Hitch with a lion. You had him doing, well, I must say, these lead-ins would come in, and I'd say to Joan Harrison, we can't show this to him. He'll never do this. I mean, never. We better send this back. She said, Hitch will do it. And he did.
The man who made Hitchcock into a television star was his agent, Lew Wasserman, head of the MCA talent agency. Wasserman embodied all the power of the so-called front office, the business end of filmmaking. He wielded the kind of authority that Hitchcock both respected and resented.
He clearly would do anything for Wasserman, and seemingly Wasserman would do everything for him, but he would put him down in lunch. Oh, well, you know, doing it for him, doing it for Wasserman, or whatever it was. Not, you know, he wasn't vicious or anything, but you could see he liked to insult the front office and make fun of them a little bit.
Under Wasserman's leadership, MCA had become one of the most powerful talent agencies Hollywood had ever seen. In 1958, it bought Universal Studios, where the Hitchcock television show was made. Wasserman's next move was to get Hitchcock away from Paramount and bring him to Universal to make his feature films. The Lever would be a dark story about a woman on the run, a strange young man, his domineering mother, and a run-down motel.
Psycho is my first attempt at a shocker. In other words, it has in its content certain episodes which do shock. In some sense it could be called a horror film, but the horror only comes to you after you've seen it, when you get home in the dark.
This was the last picture on his commitment to Paramount. And I know that they were hoping for another North by Northwest or this grand extravaganza, color, everything. And that's to do a black and white film noir, little picture. I mean, they were, you know, just threw up their hands, and they were horrified.
I couldn't believe it. I said, Hitch, why did you give this to me to read? I said, this belongs in your TV unit, not in your feature films. The brutal killing, the peeping Tom business, it was a cheap kind of a picture, not my kind of a picture, not Hitchcock's kind of a picture, I didn't think. I said, I don't want any part of this picture.
Paramount all but disowned Psycho. They were happy for it to be made on the Universal backlot, and even more pleased when Hitchcock offered to finance the film himself. For Hitchcock, however, Psycho was the biggest gamble of his life. Everyone who worked on the film was aware that budget concerns were uppermost in his mind.
I wanted, for my own sake, to do a big Technicolor wonderful movie. And the first thing that Hitch said to me was, there's a company, American International, that's making pictures for about $250,000. And he said, what if we did that? And I think what he meant by that was, what if somebody of his caliber directed one of these low-budget movies? And he told me that he had intended to do Psycho for under $1 million, that he was going to use his TV team, all those people who had worked so beautifully on his series were now going to work on this movie. And it was all kind of disappointing to me at first.
But Psycho was about more than money. The television series had won Hitchcock a younger audience. Psycho was to be their film. Screenwriter Joe Stefano, a high school dropout who was in Freudian analysis at the time, provided a vital link to the drive-in generation.
When I described the opening scene and said that they are meeting in a hotel room on her lunch hour and that they're shacking up, I got the feeling that that kind of lit him a little bit. I think that he liked the fact that I was bringing a young man's approach to this.
You never did eat your lunch, did you?
I better get back to the office. These extended lunch hours give my boss excess acid.
Why don't you call your boss and tell him you're taking the rest of the afternoon off?
C'est votre première scène en soutien-gorge dans
I think it's your first scene in a brassiere in the history of your 50 films.
I felt the need to do a scene of that kind.
Je ressentais le besoin de faire une scène de cette sorte parce que
the audiences are changing.
Les publics changent.
You know, and I think you have to give them
Et je crois qu'il faut leur donner aujourd'hui
the way they behave themselves most of the time.
La façon dont ils se conduisent eux-mêmes la plupart du temps.
This was a movie about sex. It had always been a movie about sex, as far as I was concerned. And boys and their mothers don't have any problems that aren't sexual. And I told Hitch that this was how I felt. I even told him one time that I had had a session in which I realized down deep inside that I could have murdered my mother when I was 14 years old. And he was quite astounded by that, and also quite pleased to hear it.
The shower scene took 7 days to shoot, and over 70 setups, because even though it was on the screen for 2 seconds, say the shot from up above was on the screen for 2 seconds. It still took 2 hours to set up, but because it was a very important part of the whole montage. So it was very hard. I had no idea of the impact of the shower scene when I was doing it. I knew each scene had an impact, especially the last one, but the total effect I didn't get until I actually saw it, because then I saw what he had envisioned all along, which was each cut of the film, each editing cut, was the slice of the knife.
This is Alfred Hitchcock. Having lived with Psycho since it was a gleam in my camera's eye, I now exercise my parental rights in revealing a number of significant facts about this slightly extraordinary entertainment. I've suggested that Psycho be seen from the beginning. In fact, this is more than a suggestion. It is required.
He refused to have a press show, and he made us queue up with the public, which he loved. You know, get the critics down on the level of the people that actually pay the money. And when we came out, Hitchcock was waiting in the lobby with his hands in front of his paunch, looking with delight at the aghast faces of the critics. And I said to him, you know, I honestly don't think this is going to get good notices. He said, "You don't think it'll play very well, Mr. Walker?" He said, "Perhaps not with your tribe, but I think looking at them, looking at the public, it'll play very well indeed." And it did. Cost $800,000, it made $11 million. It was his first big jackpot.
After Psycho, Hitchcock moved to Universal Studios permanently. From the top floor of the so-called Black Tower, Wasserman made sure his director wanted for nothing. The scale of Psycho's success, which took everyone by surprise, brought with it problems of its own.
Hitchcock used to complain that, you know, he was in competition with himself, and that, you know, people complained if it wasn't the kind of Hitchcock movie that they expected. And I think that had its drawbacks for him.
Hitch was their property. He belonged to them. He was supposed to do what they wanted. They let him in their house every Sunday night on television, and they wanted another Psycho.
But while fans wanted more of the same, critics seemed to want something different. The attacks of the so-called Hitchknockians had got under the director's skin. He wanted to show them that his brand of pure cinema could include characters of real psychological depth. Unfortunately, he didn't reveal these ambitions to his screenwriter, Evan Hunter, who even then was working on what he thought was a screwball comedy with a macabre twist, called The Birds.
Hitch had an agenda that was quite opposite to mine. You know, I wish he'd have told me what it was, because we could have worked it out. But he was going for a sort of respectability that he hadn't had in, or felt he hadn't had. I mean, there were those among us who felt he was respectable enough, but he felt he hadn't been given the proper respect. He showed the script to V.S. Pritchett, a friend of his who was a short story writer and noted critic in London. And I was suddenly getting suggestions that were not Hitch's suggestions.
While Hunter worked on in the dark, Hitchcock set about tackling what had by now become a major preoccupation: the creation of a female star who looked like Grace Kelly and who did as she was told.
He wanted somebody to own. He wanted a star of his own. No matter who the director is, you know, the care and feeding of stars is hard. That's hard. And I think Hitchcock got an age where he didn't want to do that anymore. He wanted one of his own. Perfectly understandable.
Feel better. Feel younger. Have the figure you want. See the pounds go. With Zero.
Now, from Pet Milk Company, Seago, new different...
I was standing in the secretarial area chatting, and the door opened to Hitch's office, and he came down to where I was standing, and there, framed in the doorway to his office, almost as if it were a deliberate shot, was this tall, glacial blonde. And Hitch walked over to him and he says, "That's Melanie." And I said, "Who is she?" And he told me she had done he saw her in a hair commercial or a shampoo commercial or something. And I said, "Do you think she's going to have the skill to do this stuff?" And he said, "Trust me, Evan."
Feel better.
Feel younger.
I really didn't have any training as an actress. I had been doing commercials. You know, I knew all about the cameras, I knew lighting, I knew all of those kinds of things, but when you're dealing with products, it's quite a different situation than being a character. And Hitch was not only my director, he was my drama coach. You know, I was a very lucky lady.
Location filming for The Birds took place in the tiny town of Bodega Bay, 2 hours north of San Francisco. As ever, pre-planning had been meticulous. But beneath the calm surface, Hitch, the auteur, was in turmoil.
I began to examine the script as I went along.
Je me suis mise à étudier le script pendant que je
travaillais. I found deficiencies in
et j'ai trouvé des faiblesses.
I went through the thing in my mind in great detail.
Dans ma tête, je y ai pensé en grand détail.
And put this new ending in.
Et j'ai mis cette nouvelle fin.
But this is in the middle of shooting the picture, which I'd never done before.
Mais ça, c'était au milieu du tournage, ce qui est une chose que je n'ai jamais fait avant.
And for the first
pour la première
time,
fois,
my crew around me said,
l'équipe autour de moi a dit,
"What's wrong with him?
Qu'est-ce qui ne va pas avec Hitchcock?
He's getting upset."
Il est tout.
Because to me, I always laugh my way through a picture.
Rigole à travers tout le film.
It was strange, you know.
Pour moi, c'est étrange.
Back at Universal Studios, Hitchcock set to work on the film's complex set pieces, culminating in the terrifying bird attack in the attic. For Tippi Hedren, the terror was all too real.
For 5 days, the 3 prop men had great huge cartons filled with ravens and seagulls and crows, you know, pigeons, and they just kept hurling birds at me for 5 days. And I would just fend them off as they came towards me.
They kept throwing birds at Tippi incessantly, nonstop, you know. Cut, all right, let's go, and change the makeup and tear the dress a little, and the suit she was wearing, tear that a little, and let's go, and more birds.
Towards the end of it, one of them jumped, and it cut my eye, just below my eye, thank God. And I just, all of a sudden, I had it with that whole thing, and I got all of the birds off of me, and I just sat in the middle of the set and just started to cry from sheer exhaustion. And everybody left the set. They just left me there.
She was in bed 3 days at the end of it.
Elle a été alitée pendant 3 jours à la fin.
Ah oui. Kaput.
Kaput.
Hitchcock had been tinkering with the script of The Birds throughout production, adding dialogue and writing new scenes designed to bring depth to the central characters. He rejected a dramatic finale in favor of a muted ending that was self-consciously European in its lack of resolution. The first test came in March 1963 at New York's Museum of Modern Art, where the film's premiere formed the centerpiece of the first ever Hitchcock retrospective.
At the end of it, there was silence. And then a polite patter of applause, and I thought, oh, you were dead.
Later that year, the Birds opened the Cannes Film Festival. The film had baffled most of his fans in America and irritated many of his critics. But thanks to champions like Truffaut, Hitchcock's critical stock was rising. A lot depended on his next film, a psychologically complex tale about a frigid kleptomaniac called Marnie. Once again, Hedren was cast in the leading role, but by now Hitchcock's attachment to his new star had taken on a new intensity.
He was kind of trying to control who I saw, what I, all of those kinds of things. So that became a very, very difficult time for me. I think he became obsessed with this character named Tippi Hedren. He felt that he had created Tippi Hedren.
I think he was having an old man's crise du coeur over Tippi, unquestionably. Hitch was very possessive about the women in his life. He was possessive of his own daughter, and Alma was his. And he even tried to do that with me.
He would not take his eyes off of me. He may be talking to somebody over here, but he was watching me all the time. And it became very difficult. Mrs. Hitchcock came to me on a number of times and said, I'm so sorry you have to go through this, or that you're going through this. So she, it was apparent to her.
Meanwhile, Evan Hunter, the original screenwriter on Marnie, was having problems of his own. One scene in particular, in which the frigid Marnie is raped on her honeymoon, would ultimately lead to a falling out with the director.
When we were discussing it for the 100th time, and I gave all my reasons, I didn't think a guy who loves her would rape her on their wedding night, and I thought it would be very difficult to rescue him after that scene for the rest of the film. And he said, Evan, and you know how directors do when they're framing a shot? He said, Evan, and he came right in like this. He said, when he sticks it in her, I want that camera right on her face. Just like that. And I thought, oh boy.
During the filming of Marnie, everything sort of went fine until probably the last quarter of the shoot. It was a 5-month shoot. And it eventually got to the point where I couldn't stand the control, or the trying to control. And I resented it so highly that I finally told him that I couldn't bear it anymore. Demands were being put onto me that I couldn't acquiesce to. And I said, I need to get out. And he told me that I really couldn't, that I had my parents to worry about, my daughter. I said, it doesn't matter, I can't live this way. And he literally said, I'll ruin your career.
She got very annoyed with him. And so Hitch said to me, he said, she said something that no one is permitted to say to me. And I said, what did she say? What did she say? And he said, she referred to my weight. And apparently what she actually said was, you fat pig, who the hell do you think you are to tell me that I can or can't do this and that? So after that, they never spoke directly to each other again throughout the shooting. It was, would you tell Mr. Hitchcock? Would you ask Miss Hedren? And that was the basis of the bust-up.
He kept me under contract. He paid me my little salary every week for a couple of years. And by that time, all of the people who did want to use me in films, because after Marnie, I was hot, and was just told I wasn't available. There was never a question of us working together again. It was just a very definite cutoff. And it was by me. I am totally responsible for it. No, I'm not. He is.
Marnie bombed at the box office. His next film, Torn Curtain, his 50th feature, fared even worse. With 3 flops in a row, Alfred Hitchcock was beginning to look dated. His response was characteristically bold. In 1967, he attempted to reinvent himself once more with a project known by its working title, Kaleidoscope Frenzy. Hitchcock wrote the sexually explicit, often brutal script himself and planned to shoot it on location in New York with a cast of unknowns.
We went to about 15 locations around the city of New York, and we went upstate New York, and we went to the Maritime Harbor where all the Liberty ships are berthed. We did all places where there was a great body of water. Turns out that water figured very heavily into the story. And every time this young boy saw water and stuff, he got turned on, and he had to commit a murder. This was a film that he was strongly believed in and really wanted to do.
Kaleidoscope Frenzy is not a light film. It begins in the first 20 minutes with one of the most brutal murders that's ever been imagined for an American screen. Lew Wasserman felt that Kaleidoscope Frenzy would do irreparable harm to the Hitchcock franchise. That Hitchcock, the director, and the marketable entity would basically come to an end if he made this film. This is despite the fact that Hitchcock went to great lengths to convince both Lew Wasserman and the board of MCA to do the film. They basically told him no. And for Hitchcock, he had not been told no probably for nearly 20 years. Probably the last no he heard was in 1946 or something from David O. Selznick. So to be told no at a studio where he was one of the preeminent directors it must have been a very difficult, almost shattering experience.
Kaleidoscope Frenzy was the last reflex of a director who for 40 years had delighted in keeping one step ahead of his audiences. Of the films that marked the end of his career, only Frenzy, shot in Britain in 1972, showed any of the old magic.
Slowly, slowly, hands slowly, let the hands drop, eyes begin to stare, let the eyes stare, open, open, open.
By now, both Hitchcock and Alma were in poor health. Alma had the first of 2 strokes during the making of Frenzy. Hitchcock himself had been fitted with a pacemaker and was drinking heavily to deaden the pain of chronic arthritis.
His arthritis in his knees was enormously painful. I still have the vision of him in mind, of his walking along the hallway of the bungalow that he occupied, holding onto the wall to come down to a little office I had at the end there. But it was just an unstated agreement that we were just going to keep Hitch going as long as he wanted to go.
In 1978, Hitchcock was working on The Short Night, his 56th feature. On one occasion, he asked screenwriter David Freeman to come to his house in Bel Air for a story session.
Alma had been ill during that period, and she was feeling better. And so he invited her to come into the story sessions. When Hitchcock saw her sitting there in their house and listening and engaged in this discussion, I could just feel the years coming off his shoulders. He never walked around during a story meeting. That's not something he did. He would sit like a Buddha, usually, and just make his decrees. But with Alma there, in their house, he got up and kind of walked around, or walked in his fashion, and I think he was showing off for her. I think it was, he was showing her that he could still do it, that she could participate, that this was possible. He was saying to his wife, look, We can make another one. This can happen. It's worth living. I don't think it was anything less than that.
Production on The Short Night was halted in May 1979. Within days, Hitchcock's office was closed. The following year, at the age of 80, and with a belated knighthood to add to countless other honours, Sir Alfred Hitchcock died. Alma, his toughest critic and fiercest defender, died 2 years later.
If you could make only one more picture, perish the thought, but if you could only make one more picture, what would it be about?
I think it would be about murder, mayhem, violence, sex, beautifully pictorially expressed, lovely costumes, perfect cutting, and a joke or two.
UK TV G2 are showing the RBS Six Nations rugby highlights tonight at 7:30. But next here on History, Cary Grant's running out of the milk of human kindness in Alfred Hitchcock's Suspicion. Don't go away.